All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. And thank you for joining me in another live broadcast. I am your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio. We stream every Wednesday evening, 8 to 10 p.m. East Coast, United States of America. I live near Athens, Georgia. And tonight, Lisa is still in the Philippines, so I'm going to be running solo tonight. But I am going to cover a very interesting topic. One that I think, especially for those of you that are not familiar with what I'm going to be speaking about, the name of the show is The Titanic Deception, which is, it connects to what happened with the tragedy of the sinking of the Titanic and how that had to do with seizing power here in the United States and basically across the world as well, because once the Federal Reserve System was put into place, we know that the globalists, the elitists, that they have utilized their control of the Ponzi Federal Reserve notes to print the money and loan it to especially the United States government at interest. And that the people, not that this was ever ratified or constitutional, but the people have been made to pay with a tax on their wages and earnings to pay down the interest on the debt that has been accrued by the banksters to basically enslave all the people, the masses, and people everywhere. Central banks and this concept of establishing a central bank and loaning money to certain tyrants, puppets on a string, and then foisting that debt upon the people. That this is what has been going on for a very long time. Let me make sure that you guys can hear me. Give me a shout out in the chat room if you can hear me. All right. Well, hopefully everything is going well. But I appreciate everybody's patience. The technology, especially when you flip flop from different platforms, it is screwy, and all the settings get jacked up, which is my problem. Um, Especially when I'm running solo like this, but it does seem like things are going okay. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate that. Just wanted to make sure. All right, let me go ahead and go into the show. I wanted to share a passage, a quote with you. But let me. I want to move this over so that I can read it easier. And everybody, please pray that my voice maintains strength. Throughout this evening, and I can finish up what I'm trying to do. It's going to be a very interesting show, especially for those of you that are not familiar with the topic of how the Federal Reserve plays into the sinking of the Titanic. It's a very interesting storyline. It's much like what happened on 9/11, which, people are not very familiar with as well. And that has to do with the whole event being a large insurance fraud claim, as was the sinking of the Titanic, which most people don't know about, but we'll get into that. We're going to go portion by portion. I did this show way back in 2016 where I explained this concept, but I know we have a lot of new listeners, and that most people are still not very familiar with what I'm going to be talking about this evening. But let's start with a quote from JFK. And this is a very famous quote, of course. He said, "The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in surfing the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it is in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned. No rumor is printed. No secret is revealed. And how true is that? Because the monolithic conspiracy is hiding things in plain sight. And you can see the symbolism all over the world in structures, in buildings, in cityscapes, in the outlines and outlay of streets, in the obelisks that exist everywhere, the Statue of Liberty. I mean, the symbolism is everywhere. The secret societies, the icons that they use, the ancient Babylonian worship of forces like Baal, the dragon, and even what had occurred in the garden with the trees and the sexual iconography. This is all celebrated in plain sight, as is the true nature and structure of world. It's so funny how so many are opposed to biblical cosmology, and yet every one of the leaders of the free world, including Trump just recently, speaking at the United Nations, there is a seal there, massive, in the chambers where, the different prime ministers and presidents and people of influence give their opinion or their speeches to the rest of the quote unquote global audience. And yet this seal truly depicts the earth in the true nature, in its true form. And yet nobody questions, nobody second guesses what's the meaning behind the azimuthal equidistant projection map that is flown on the banner of the United Nations, the seat of world government. And we know that the elites have planned for a very long time. One of the goals of the establishment of the Federal Reserve was to empower a central League of Nations type system of governance where each one of the countries of the world bowed down to a global power. And no nation, including America, being as strong and mighty as we have been, even though our superiority has been diminished quite a bit since 9/11 and the war on terror and the establishment of this $36 trillion in debt, which is like $1 billion in interest a day. I mean, it's something just absolutely insane, which we cannot perpetuate. That's why we have a government shutdown right now. The Republicans, of course, were going to fund continuance of the government to pay federal employees, but the Democrats want to install into the bill and the budget paying for the health care of illegal immigrants, which of course is not a deterrent, but an encouragement to them to continue running to this country and entering in illegally. And we see that, the ICE agents, those that enforce our border security and deport these criminals, they are largely being targeted by Antifa and the agent provocateurs, which are paid by extreme leftist individuals like George Soros and others. But we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Let's talk a little bit about the central banking and how that came about and why it's important to understand the Ponzi scheme that is the central bank and the Federal Reserve System. First, a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I sincerely believe with you that Banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. And is that not true? I mean, all this debt is supposed to be laid up on the backs of those that are not yet even born. And all politicians do is kick the can down the road. That's all they do. And there has been a long, very long effort to establish a central bank here in America. Goes back to Andrew Jackson getting shot, almost killed 7 times. Also, Abraham Lincoln, when he released the Treasury notes, he was also assassinated. Even though, a lot of people want to say that it was because of the Emancipation Proclamation. That is not the case at all. The truth is that he opposed a central bank established, by foreign powers and the old Rothschild money elitists getting their hands on the governance here in America and being able to manipulate it. As Meyer Amschel Rothschild said, he said, I care not who governs, just he wanted to be able to print the money to fund the governance and to control the governments in the world in that manner. So we're going to spend just the first part of the show talking about the central banks, and because it's going to lead up to the opposition, Jacob Astor and Guggenheim and others that were voices of opposition to the establishment of the central bank, but they ended up being passengers on the Titanic, which was sunk purposely. And we're going to get into that as well. But first, let's go into this somewhat. I'll read. And then I'll check the chat. So if you have any questions or comments, put them in all caps and I'll try to get to them. But wait for me to have a break to where I'll look at it. I'll go through a few passages, comment, check the chat, and we'll do it like this for the remainder of the show. There were numerous attempts in the 1880s to create a central bank in America. Most of these attempts point back to the Rothschilds. It is interesting that both the original American banking houses that represented Rothschild, August Belmont, and the Erlangers, funded the North and South respectively during the American Civil War. It's always that way. They always fund both sides because they make money off of selling the arms. They are the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower also warned about in his farewell address to the American people. Which, if you have not heard that, you should check it out. It fits right along with what JFK said about the secret societies and the powers that are behind the military-industrial complex. Abraham Lincoln saw the power play behind this masquerade as one bank was seemingly played against the other. The invisible hand underneath was never seen by the multitudes. Lincoln did see it, for he had resisted the pressure to create in America a central private bank that would print its money. He also spotted the, quote, divide and conquer movement, where the North was pitted against the South, with both sides financed by the same money elite. This is always, it's the modus operandi. It's something that has been played out over and over and over. the conquistadors, the all of the colonials, the colonists, people that went into different nations and took over countries by um, arming the enemies of the established order. And they always control from the top down. They don't do the dirty work. They just provide the arms for people to slaughter each other. And that's always the modus operandi of the Illuminati elite. It's been something that has been tried and proven over ages and centuries and even millennia of time. Abraham Lincoln battled for the right of Congress and the Treasury to hold the awesome power of coining money. He knew that to surrender this power to private banks was ultimately to surrender the sovereignty of America. Adams and Jefferson had warned of this all along, defying the hidden bankers. Lincoln issued the greenbacks, and interestingly, Lincoln was soon assassinated thereafter. Quote, "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of war. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who even question its methods or throw light upon its crimes. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions at the rear. The latter is my greatest foe." President Abraham Lincoln. 40 years later, John Pierpont Morgan created the Panic of 1907, where the stock market fell nearly 50% from its peak in 1906. The economy was in recession, and there were numerous runs on banks and trust companies. Early in 1907, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, in a speech to the New York Chamber of Commerce, warned that unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, the country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in its history. The primary cause of the Panic of 1907 was a retraction of loans by some banks that began in New York and soon spread across the nation, leading to the closing of banks and businesses. Complete ruin of the national economy was averted when J.P. Morgan stepped in by organizing a team of bank and trust executives who redirected money between banks, secured further international lines of credit, and bought plummeting stocks of healthy corporations. Isn't that always the way of it as well? Problem, reaction, solution, the Hegelian dialectic. They create the problem, and then they come in with their solution, and it always benefits them. And increasingly, with power, control, wealth, status, and above the law capability. Morgan gained numerous holdings as well as his bid to be the Rothschilds' #1 American agent. J.P. Morgan's real feat and service to Rothschild in the Panic of 1907 was that he created a mood in America to believe that a central bank would prevent such a panic from occurring again, and thus became receptive to a central bank. See, that is the desired outcome. They wanted a central bank because it's with the central bank, the Federal Reserve, the control of the interest rates, that they create the boom and the bust. The severity of the downturn was such that it eventually pressured the United States Congress to accept the proposal by a group of bankers to pass the Federal Reserve Act, or the Glass-Owen Bill, essentially a blueprint of the Nelson-Aldrich plan that had been defeated in Congress earlier. If you've not read The Creature from Jekyll Island, that book is also about the banksters getting together here at Jekyll Island in Georgia and writing up, establishing what would become the Federal Reserve Act. And this was pushed through Congress on Christmas Eve, when most of the representatives, the constituents from different parts of the country, had already left for holiday. But they were able to keep certain members behind, ratify it with a 2/3 vote, and implement it and pass it. And that has been the downfall of America and the world ever since. Because, as I said, the Federal Reserve System is not a government agency. It is a privately owned European banking conglomerate that we don't even know. It's never been audited, so we don't even know who actually owns the stock of the Federal Reserve banking system. Senate Republican leader and financial expert Nelson Aldrich headed the National Monetary Commission set up following the Panic of 1907. Aldrich set up two commissions, one to study the American monetary system in depth and the other, headed by Aldrich himself, to study the European central banking systems and report on them. All right, I'm just going to read a little bit more. I mean, this is very lengthy. I mean, it's really like a book. It's so in depth, but just laying the foundation for what we're going to go into. But this is the root of Ponzi economics here in America. That's why, on the Federal Reserve notes, you have Masonic symbolism, the eye at the top of the Illuminati pyramid, separated, detached from the masses that work underneath this agency. They are the ones that have to, they're the army of what is the global outreach, the octopus of the matrix system. All right, hold on one second. All right, gonna try to maintain water so I can keep my voice going. Centralized banking was met with such opposition from politicians who were suspicious of a central bank and who charged that Aldrich was biased due to his close ties to wealthy bankers, such as J.P. Morgan and his daughter's marriage to John D. Rockefeller. I mean, those are some extreme power brokers. Those names are still very widely established here in America, almost like American royalty. Very, very wealthy families. In 1910, Aldrich and executives representing the banks of J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Kuhn Loeb and Company secluded themselves for 10 days at Jekyll Island, Georgia. The executives included Frank Vanderlip, the president of the National City Bank of New York, associated with the Rockefellers; Henry Davison, the senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company; Charles D. Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York; and Colonel Edward House, who would later become President Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor and the founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. which, if you don't know what the Council on Foreign Relations is and the Trilateral Commission, they are forces, supposed to be government think tanks, that support establishing world governance and having the United States bow down to this central authority. There, Paul Warburg of Kunloeb and Company directed the proceedings and wrote the primary features of the Federal Reserve Act. This bill allowed a group of bankers to create and to buy the shares and own the Federal Reserve System in 1913. Morgan's own bank, the Morgan Guaranty Trust, was allowed to be among the inner circle of primary owners of the Federal Reserve. Despite the importance of the Jekyll Island meeting, it remained a secret to both the public and the government until journalist Bertie Charles Forbes wrote an article about it in 1916, 3 years after the Federal Reserve Act was passed. The Federal Reserve Act called for the creation of 12 private regional Federal Reserve banks, acting as fiscal agents for the U.S. Treasury, each with its own branches, board of directors, and district boundaries. And the system was to be headed by a 7-member Federal Reserve Board, made up of public officials appointed by the President. Also created as part of the Federal Reserve System was a 12-member Federal Advisory Committee and a single new United States currency, the Federal Reserve Note. Representative Charles Lindbergh Sr., the most vocal opponent of the bill and a member of the House Banking and Currency Committee, who on the day before the Federal Reserve Act was passed, told Congress, "This is the Aldrich Bill in disguise. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetuated by the banking bill. The banks have been granted the special privilege of distributing the money, and they charge as much as they wish. This is the strangest, most dangerous advantage ever placed in the hands of a special privileged class by any government that ever existed. The system is private. There should be no legal tender other than that issued by the government. The people are the government. Therefore, the government should, as the Constitution provides, regulate the value of money." And this was in the Congressional Record, December 22nd, 1913. President Wilson named Warburg and other prominent experts to direct the new system, which began operations in 1915 and played a major role in financing the Allied and American war efforts. Warburg was the only appointee asked to appear before Senate, whose members questioned him about his interest in the central bank and his ties to Kunloeb and Company's money trusts. With virtually all the banks on the brink of collapse, President Roosevelt succeeded in establishing the Federal Reserve Board as the authority in banking. Independent banks were not forced to join the Federal Reserve System, but those that did not found they could not transact business through any member bank. The central bank can inflate the currency. It can reallocate funds to distressed areas through loans, and it can create money out of thin air through the use of fractional reserve lending. The central banking system now determines interest rates for virtually every bank in the country. A change in the reserve requirement or a discount policy will affect the lives of every American, regardless of their economic status. All right, just a little bit more about the Federal Reserve. This is about boom and bust, which are artificial. Just like starvation is a man made problem, it's not for lack of food or the bounty of nature that people are starving. It's because food is controlled and it is um, it is used to control and to maintain power over people. It says it in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, how they would use food and the starvation of the masses to incite riots and to bring on a problem reaction solution as necessary, as needed, as desired by the banking conglomerates. The actions of the Federal Reserve Board have proven to be the first cause in the death of our economy. The stop and go monetary policy created by these institutions makes business conditions unpredictable and thus inhibits investment and productivity. They have also been proven susceptible to political pressure for cheaper credit. When governments control the money supply, even indirectly, they have always, throughout history, abused that power. Inflationary creation of base money serves to enlarge the government's command over real resources in a way hidden from the people. The wealth redistributive power of money injections makes it suitable for use as a vote buying tool. It should be obvious the monetary disorders of nations can only be caused by their existing monetary authorities, especially in the absence of any real competition. Competition, which is the only force which keeps commercial action honest. That's the free market, which we have a manipulated market. All right, let me skip down. I'll share this passage for moving on. Central banks act in secrecy, and consequently, they are not held accountable. They consider themselves and act as if they are above the law. What's more, this secrecy favors the insiders, and it is this fundamental principle upon which central bank market intervention has been constructed, including, for example, the ongoing intervention in the gold market. Now, I'm going to comment a couple things here. I'm not sure if you are aware, but Bitcoin, which is digital gold, just hit another all-time high. It was yesterday or the day before, 126,670, I believe it was. Gold also is about to breach $4,000 an ounce. And silver is at $50 an ounce, and it will soon break its all-time high of $55 an ounce. Because metal prices are going up in value, and because the manipulated, as far as the paper audits and the how they sell the stocks of gold, GLD, and silver on the market, but it's not really. The stocks are supposed to be backed by physical gold and silver. They're not really. And because of that, they're able to depress the prices. And they've been able to keep them down. But lately, nations have been demanding delivery. And because of that, the prices of gold have increased in value. And also with the uncertainty as far as, the world economics and the status of world inflation, with the ongoing quantitative easing, which is the Federal Reserve basically printing money and buying the treasury, the treasury bills, the T-bills, put out by the U.S. government in order to fund our debt and to keep the government afloat. This is also a Ponzi scheme, but they're able to do it because of the Federal Reserve System and it being put into place. And so they create the boom and bust. But one other comment with regard to the price of gold being at $4,000, and I'll check the chat room as well, is that recently in California, in a lot of these liberal bastions, the sanctuary cities, where they invite all the criminal, illegal immigrants to come and to stay, and they will pay for their health care and their housing and everything else, when they won't even take care of, the veterans and homeless citizens of America. Well, now, because of gold being $4,000 an ounce, you are seeing organized crime. Literally, hundreds of people all targeting a jewelry store and then smashing through with a vehicle and then all running in, invading the place, and with ice picks breaching, what's supposed to be bulletproof or shatterproof glass. And then within 45 seconds, they will steal the entire inventory of that particular jewelry store. Millions of dollars lost. And what does California do? Nothing. Not even a slap on the wrist. And because these people have been getting away with it, it used to be where they'd raid a convenience store and everybody would steal all the candy and all the potato chips, all the beer and the lottery tickets and the beef jerky and the Slim Jims and all that. Well, no more. They've graduated to bigger and better things. And it's because they've not been punished, and because the cops have their hands strapped. They even want to defund the police. How ridiculous that is, but that's the liberal sanctuary cities, like states in California, New York. This kind of thing is, happening on a widespread scale. So much so that the businesses are leaving. And so what are they going to do when they don't even have, businesses to cater to take care of, and to support the populations that are in those areas? It's absolute lunacy. But, it is what it is. All right. Let us continue. All right. I know I'm going to run out of time quickly. So with second hour, I'm going to focus on what is how the Titanic fits into this whole story and this whole narrative. All right, another quote. What is needed here is a return to the Constitution of the United States. We need to have a complete divorce of bank and state. The old struggle that was fought out here in Jackson's day must be fought over again. The Federal Reserve Act should be repealed, and the Federal Reserve banks, having violated their charters, should be liquidated immediately. Faithless government officers who have violated their oath of office should be impeached and brought to trial. Unless this is done by us, I predict that the American people, outraged, robbed, pillaged, insulted, and betrayed as they are in their own land, will rise in their wrath and send a president here who will sweep the money changers out of the temple. Congressman Louis McFadden. I wish that would have happened. Even, with as many good things as Trump has done, the Federal Reserve remains in place and Fort Knox remains unaudited. Nobody knows if there's anything in there. And the rumor is that the gold has been emptied out long ago and was given up as collateral to these elitists for the preponderance of debt that America has strapped on itself. Oh, I've got so much, but I can't cover it all. As far as I told you about Abraham Lincoln being killed, that was also the Federal Reserve banking powers behind the scenes, Oz behind the mask. Andrew Jackson, he was, shot at and almost killed 7 times. He said in 1835, President Andrew Jackson declared his disdain for the international bankers. He said, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." And I really wish that the people understood and knew what was going on, because unfortunately they don't. James Garfield, he was also killed, and President Garfield openly declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. After only 4 months in office, President Garfield was shot at a railroad station on July 2nd, 1881. Another coincidence? I think not. John F. Kennedy. Not a lot of people know that he also issued Treasury notes that were separate from the Federal Reserve System, and that the government did not have to pay interest on to borrow. And of course, he said he was going to shut down the CIA, and he was waging war against these secret societies. He was wanting to, even bring to justice some aspects of, like the FBI director, things like that. But of course, he was murdered for his efforts as well. President John F. Kennedy planned to exterminate the Federal Reserve System. In 1963, he signed Executive Orders EO 11 and EO 110, returning to the government the responsibility to print the money, taking that privilege away from the Federal Reserve. And it was shortly thereafter that President F. Kennedy was assassinated. And so, the Federal Reserve, those particular powers that be, the Oz behind the mask, they are responsible for a lot of murders, assassins. Remember how Christ said that ye are of your father the devil, and that you are and your fathers were the assassins of all the prophets? This falls into line with all of that. There's a great documentary. It's called The Money Masters. It's about 3.5 hours long, but if you watch it, it will give you a great idea as to how all this ties into so many assassinations of so many prominent congressional, representatives, senators. I'll give you two before we go into the next hour when I talk about how the Titanic ties in with this conspiracy reality, because it truly is an ongoing conspiracy. In the 1970s and 80s, Congressman Larry P. McDonald spearheaded efforts to expose the hidden holdings and intentions of the international money interests. His efforts ended on August 31st, 1983, when he was killed when Korean Airlines 007 was quote unquote accidentally shot down in Soviet airspace. Another strange coincidence? I think not. How about Senator John Hines and former Senator John Tower had served on powerful Senate banking and finance committees and were outspoken critics of the Federal Reserve and the Eastern establishment. On April 4th, 1991, Senator John Hines was killed in a plane crash near Philadelphia. On the very next day, April 5th, 1991, former Senator John Tower was also killed in a plane crash. Coincidence? Too many coincidences. All right. Remember how Ron Paul was calling for the audit of the Federal Reserve? But, of course, that never happened. I was hoping that with Elon and Doge and with Trump going into office, because he's really shaked up a lot of stuff. They have done really good for the world. RFK removing the fluoride out of the water, connecting autism with the thimerosal, which is a mercury preservative put into vaccines to make it multi-dosable. It's unnecessary. Aluminum, which dries up the mind, leads to dementia. And, the Tylenol was just the least of it. But I just recently also heard, the liberals hate Trump so much that females, after hearing of this declaration put out, this proclamation put out by RFK and Trump, that Tylenol, you don't want to take Tylenol while you're pregnant. A bunch of these liberal women, pregnant, hating Trump so much, they put themselves and their child at risk by taking a bunch of Tylenol. And there's a story, you can find it online. This nurse talked about how she went in, the very next day in the morning. She had a 4 o'clock shift. She returned home at 6 o'clock. But she talked about the sad story of a woman that was brought in for taking so much Tylenol that her liver failed and her organs began to shut down. And they were going to have to decide on whether to save her or save the baby. And the husband, who came home and found her, just out of her wits and devastated by taking all this Tylenol, he had to make the decision of taking her off life support and donating her organs to other individuals, which, I've done many shows. You do not want to be an organ donor. It's not worth it to get a discount on your license renewal. Make sure, because if you are an organ donor, you are targeted by our for-profit healthcare system. And every body is about $2 million to the for-profit healthcare system. So don't make yourself target, because they will put you in a coma and then, lie to your family. This happens. There's articles out there from nurses, doctors, talking about how this occurs. I've written a bunch of poems about it in what will be the release of my newest books. But just a warning. All right. Gosh, we are quickly running out of time. All right. We'll be back. It is 57 after. I'll be back 2 minutes after the top of the hour, and we'll pick this up with the sinking of the Titanic. Be right back, everyone. Just a few. All right. Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for your time and patience. And I promise I'm going to try to figure out and get the whole commercial thing working so that you don't have to just sit there in silence. And when people that don't know what's going on tune in, they may think, something's up with the show. So I'm going to try to figure all that out as well. It's just, technically challenged with all this stuff. But again, I appreciate everybody and thank you. And I'll get back into this. We're going to talk about the sinking of the Titanic and how this also plays in to the Federal Reserve System and the establishment of a central bank here in America. Since the early 1830s, America did not have a central bank. The Jesuits desperately wanted another central bank in America so that they would have a bottomless reservoir from which to draw money for their many wars and other hideous schemes around the world. In 1910, seven men met on Jekyll Island just off the coast of Georgia to establish a central bank which they called the Federal Reserve Bank. I'm not going to go into the names. I already read all that. The Morgans were friendly competitors with the Rothschilds and became socially close to them. Morgan's London-based firm was saved from financial ruin in 1857 by the Bank of England, over which the Rothschilds held great influence. Thereafter, Morgan appears to have served as a Rothschild financial agent and went to great lengths to appear totally American. His, Rockefeller's, entry into the field was not welcomed by Morgan, and they became fierce competitors. Eventually, they decided to minimize their competition by entering into joint ventures. In the end, they worked together to create a national banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System. G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Amazing book. Check it out. It will expose all of what I'm talking about. And for those of you that don't know that the Federal Reserve has been a European banking system, you need to really learn about these things because it's important. It's influencing us and affecting us in this day and age as well. These three financial families, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, and the Rockefellers, all do the bidding of the Jesuit order because of the Jesuit infiltration in their organizations. The building of the Titanic began in 1909 at a shipyard in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. The Titanic was one of a fleet of ships owned by the White Star Line, an international shipping company. Banking was not the only business in which Morgan had a strong financial interest. Using his control over the nation's railroads as financial leverage, he had created an international shipping trust, which included Germany's two largest lines plus one of the two in England, the White Star Lines. There were a number of very rich and powerful men who made it abundantly clear that they were not in favor of the Federal Reserve System. J.P. Morgan was ordered by the Jesuits to build the Titanic. This unsinkable ship would serve as the death ship for those who opposed the Jesuits' plan for a Federal Reserve System. These rich and powerful men would have been able to block the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and their power and fortunes had to be taken out of their hands. Three of the richest and most important of these were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Strass, the head of Macy's department stores, and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world at that time. Well, publicly maybe, but the Rothschilds, they are generational wealth. Their total wealth at that time, using dollar values of their day, was more than $500 million. Today, that amount of money would be worth nearly $11 billion. Edward Smith was the captain of the Titanic. He had been traveling the North Atlantic waters for 26 years and was the world's most experienced master of the North Atlantic routes. He had worked for Jesuit J.P. Morgan for many years. Edward Smith was a Jesuit tempore coadjutor. This means that he was not a priest, but he was a Jesuit of the short robe. Jesuits are not necessarily priests. Those who are not priests serve the order through their profession. Anyone can be a Jesuit, and their identity would not be known. Edward Smith served the Jesuit order in his profession as a sea captain. Many interesting points about the Titanic are discussed in a videotape made by the National Geographic in 1986. The videotape is entitled The Secrets of the Titanic. When the Titanic departed from southern England on April 10, 1912, Francis Brown, the Jesuit master of Edward Smith, boarded the Titanic. This man was the most powerful Jesuit in all of Ireland and answered directly to the general of the Jesuit order in Rome. The videotape discusses a vacationing priest, Father Francis Brown, caught these poignant snapshots of his fellow passengers, most of them on a voyage to eternity. The next day, the Titanic made her last stop off the coast of Queenstown, Ireland. Here, tenders brought out the last passengers, mostly Irish immigrants headed for new homes in America. And here, the lucky Father Brown disembarked. Father Brown caught Captain Smith peering down from Titanic's bridge, poised on the brink of destiny. The Secrets of the Titanic, National Geographic, 1986. Here is Jesuit treachery at its finest. The provincial Father Francis Brown boards the Titanic, photographs the victims, and most assuredly briefs the captain concerning his oath as a Jesuit, and the following morning bids him farewell. Eric John Phelps, Vatican Assassins. Brown went over with Edward Smith one last time exactly what he was supposed to do in the North Atlantic waters. The Jesuit general told Francis Brown what was to happen. Brown then tells Smith, and the rest is history. After 3 days at sea with only one pair of glasses for the bridge, Edward Smith propelled the Titanic full speed ahead, 22 knots on a moonless dark night, through a gigantic ice field, nearly 80 square miles in area. Edward Smith did this despite at least 8 telegrams warning him to be more cautious because he was going too fast. Did Edward Smith need one caution? No, he had been traveling those waters for 26 years. He knew there were icebergs in that area, but 8 cautions did not stop this man, who was under the Jesuit oath and under orders to destroy the Titanic. The encyclopedias paint a very tragic picture of Smith in his last hours. When it came time to give the order to load and lower the lifeboats, Smith wavered and one of his aides had to approach him for the order to be given. Smith's legendary skills of leadership seemed to have left him. He was curiously indecisive and unusually cautious on that fatal night. John Jacob Astor's wife got into a lifeboat and was saved, while John Jacob Astor perished in the waters of the North Atlantic. There were not enough lifeboats, and many of them were only half full, with only women and children. To prevent nearby freighters from responding with help, the distress flares were white when they should have been red. White flares to passing fire freighters state that everybody was having a party. The unsinkable ship, the floating palace, was created to be the tomb of the wealthy who opposed the Federal Reserve System. And by April 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve was eliminated. In December 1913, the Federal Reserve System came into being in the United States. 8 months later, the Jesuits had sufficient funding through the Federal Reserve Bank to begin World War I. Now, I'm going to quote from a different article. It's Titanic, the Shocking Truth. Insurance fraud by famous investor without a conscience. Titanic, the Shocking Truth. In the period of 1910 to 1912, the transatlantic passenger routes were very lucrative. The White Star Line got together with a wealthy American investor and devised a plan to build the 3 largest, most luxurious ships to try to corner the market. These were to be the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The Olympic was the first to be built and made several trips with Captain Smith, who was involved in 3 accidents which critically damaged the Olympic, including one case where he ran over a submerged vessel. Temporary repairs were made to the Olympic in New York and limped back to the shipyard in Ireland to be fixed. The damage to the keel was so bad that the ship had a permanent list to port, meaning that it leaned to the left. The damaged propeller was replaced with propeller number 401, which was on the Titanic, which was in the process of being built, and placed on the Olympic so it could keep functioning. The shipyard told White Star that in order to properly repair the Olympic with the severe internal damage and damage to the keel, that it would have to be cut into and the entire stern section would have to be rebuilt, which would take lots of time and lots of money. White Star declined, electing to do a patch-up job so that the Olympic could continue sailing. The Olympic was in its damaged condition only insurable for about $7 million, whereas the Titanic, when completed, would be insured for over $10 million. However, the Olympic remained a liability. The Olympic and Titanic were virtually identical, other than minor differences. As White Star needed the cash to keep coming in, it needed a big event. However, the Titanic was not yet finished. Thus, a decision was made to switch the two ships. Over the course of a weekend, a crew from the shipyard switched the names of the boats, the lifeboats, and the stationery. Everything else, the plates, etc., was standard White Star fare, not naming the ship. Photos of the Titanic leaving Southampton show the patch-up work, and a science teacher who was a passenger on the, quote, Titanic noticed that the ship had a slight list to port. So, let me stop here. So, understand that the Titanic was going to be sunk in order to collect the insurance on what was the Olympic, which was damaged. And they switched these two ships out, knowing that they were going to sink it and collect the insurance. In the same way that Larry Silverstein bought the two World Trade Centers, which, if you don't know the history about it, the World Trade Centers were built with a steel outer frame, and their walls were lined with asbestos. And they were a hazard, and there was no way to be able to insure them in the way to take out that asbestos and to make it to where it wasn't dangerous to the public. Well, anyways, we know that Larry Silverstein bought those buildings and had them insured for $7 billion each. Just a few months, like 5 months, before the events of September 11th. Which, coincidence? I think not. Photos from the sunken Titanic show that there was gray undercoating paint under the surface black paint. The Titanic did not use gray paint. This was only used on the Olympic. Photos of one of the propellers on the sunken ship show one with the number 401 on it. The propeller that was made for the Titanic but put on the Olympic. The names Olympic and Titanic were engraved on the front of each of the ships when they were being built. Photographs from Robert Ballard's original expedition, when he found the sunken Titanic in 1986, show at the bow, the front of the sunken ship, the letters TIT and then space IC, which were riveted onto the front of the ship. The missing letters AN fell off over the years. The space where these letters fell off show the letters MP engraved onto the ship, the Olympic, which again shows that it's not the Titanic that went down, but the Olympic. And it was more than just to collect the insurance. It was also to kill off the opposition to the establishment of a Federal Reserve Bank here in America. White Star had another passenger ship called the Californian, which left port 4 days before the Titanic and came to rest along the line of sight from the exact iceberg which Titanic struck. During the night of the sinking, the captain of the Californian telegraphed Captain Smith of the Titanic, the same Captain Smith who had the multiple accidents while the captain of the Olympic. 4 times with Californian's exact location. The Californian, a passenger ship, also left port with no passengers. The only cargo was crates of sweaters. The captain of the Californian was told by White Star that if he saw red, white, and blue rockets during the night that these would be from the Titanic. He did not see any such rockets. The quote-unquote Titanic was of such a state of art at the time, and its officers with such experience, that they testified that they could spot an iceberg from at least 6 to 8 miles from the deck and farther from the crow's nest. The Titanic's rounding space was only 1,800 feet. As such, the Titanic would have had more than enough time and room to avoid any icebergs. The attempt to turn was not made until the iceberg was only less than 400 yards away, and the engineers, by reversing the engines and turning to port, placed the ship in the position vis-a-vis the iceberg, which caused the maximum amount of exposure to the iceberg and damage from it. The Olympic had worn linoleum floors, and days before the Titanic, quote, took off, the linoleum floors were ordered by White Star to be carpeted. 5 days before it set sail, White Star upped the insurance on the Titanic to $12 million through Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's paid out the $12 million within 5 days after the sinking. Lloyd's paid the entire claim, as the British Board of Inquiry found that neither the captain or anyone at White Star or anyone at the shipyard was at fault for the, quote, accident. So, what we have here is a company which had a liability which it knew would lose money and cost a lot to fix, and which, knowing this, disguised it as a good product and took out the maximum insurance on it, and then collected the insurance within 10 days after it was taken out, and just 5 days after the liability had an accident. Sound familiar? The investment banks had billions of bad mortgages, which they knew would fail. They disguised these known bad mortgage loans and represented to the insurance companies that the mortgages were good and took out the maximum amount of insurance on them. When the mortgages failed, which the investment banks knew would eventually happen, they collected the insurance checks as the failure was of no fault of theirs. It was those, quote, damned homeowners who didn't pay their mortgages. By the way, the American investor who owned a controlling interest in the White Star Line canceled his first-class passage on the ship less than 2 days before the Titanic took off, citing ill health. He was found in a French resort 2 days after the sinking with his mistress. If the White Star had gone into bankruptcy, this investor who had the controlling interest in White Star would have been able to seize the boats as assets, but it would have cost him probably millions to get them back to the U.S., to outfit them, market them, and to try to make money on them while having to run a passenger ship business instead of just getting checks every month from White Star, who did all the work in running the boats, marketing them, selling tickets, and etc., and just sending the investor checks every month. The name of this American investor? J.P. Morgan. That's right. J.P. Morgan. So, you see that there are no coincidences. And that what has been going down with, like I brought up many different stories. There's one other story I'm going to share at the end of all of this, which has to do with the disappearance of that flight MH370, which was never found. And it's interesting that there's one of the industrial elitists that had something to do with that and how he benefited from the disappearance of that ship as well. Huh. I was just reading something that Tammy had put in the chat. She said that this is the same with the little tank that went out this past year. I think she's talking about the submersible. And that there was a very rich man on this, and he ran the environmental something group, and they knew that the tank wasn't going to make it that depth into the water, and then it breaks up there. But I don't know that side of the story. So if you have more information on that, post it in the chat there, Tammy, and I'll share it. And also, anybody that has any questions, comments, anything of interest that you'd like to bring up, I'm opening up the next 30 minutes for such discussion. Or even if you have questions that you want to ask me about anything, I'll be glad to answer those questions as well. Rolando says that the Titanic had a sister ship which was closely and almost identical and was disguised to do the bidding that you mentioned. Yes, the name of that ship is called the Olympic. And he says that the fallen angels are here inhabiting leaders and Hollywood stars and high-level musicians, without a doubt. And again, you see this in all of the symbolism. The musicians covering up one eye, always showing the Illuminati pyramid, Rockefeller, all of this. Hello, Paulino and Chelsea. Welcome, and thank you, Tammy and Brick and Rolando and Annie and everybody else that's in the chat. I appreciate you all listening and, opening your mind to this particular story. It is a very interesting one. Hello, Adrian, and thank you as well. Oh, gosh. Sorry, my nose is a little stopped up from I guess it's the fall allergies. But I hope wherever you are, everybody. Hello, Sherry. Good to see you, sister. Wherever you guys are, that you are being blessed. Because we are living in strange and awkward times. And these powers that be, the Oz behind the mask, those that pull the strings of the politicians, because politicians are mainly just uh, puppets on a string. There is a power so pervasive, so sinister in its evil, that they have been manufacturing crisis. I mean, when you really look into false flag events and how they are utilized by the power elite to increase the budgeting and funding for programs like Homeland Security, how, the Patriot Act was written and put into place before the events of September 11th ever happened. We're talking about, a bill that was hundreds of pages long and that gave the alphabet agencies free reign to break the law, to monitor, to tap all the communications, and even like, just I saw a story. Pam Bondi was talking about how James Comey and the Democrats under the Biden administration, how they had weaponized the justice system, the judicial department, how they were spying on senators, Lindsey Graham, others. There were 6, Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee. They were spying on them, listening to all of their calls, gathering information on them because they were trying to take down Trump and, other Republican conservatives. And even the Obama administration practiced the same type of weaponization of the Justice Department. And hello, Donna. Good to see you, sister. So, anyways, I'll give you an update also on my books. I've been working diligently. I decided to do one final read through just to make it say exactly what I wanted to say. And I wanted to add some stuff. Of course, I wrote about Charlie Kirk and all of that, which there's something very odd about that whole deal as well. Certainly, Charlie Kirk was not shot from the front. He was shot from the back, and the hole in his neck was the exit wound. And, I talked about this in a previous show, but for those that may have missed it, there's a lot of weirdness going on. And I've also been watching how The Simpsons talked about this. They talked about, seemingly what happened with Charlie Kirk, even his funeral. And, I mean, it's just strange. All the prophetic weirdness that is released on The Simpsons. It makes you want to watch it just to see what they're talking about, what they're releasing, and what they're planning. There's another story, that when we had the oil leak, I believe it was the Horizon disaster, and how it leaked all those millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf, which I'm very surprised that the oceans were able to sustain and clean themselves, and that all the creatures didn't die, and that the Gulf just didn't become purely toxic. It's amazing. I mean, how the environment can take care of itself and heal itself in such capacity. But anyway, there was a book written, I think, like 100 years prior, talking about this happening. And there's another something too I want to make mention before I go into the last and final story for this evening. And that has to do with, what was I just about to say? I lost my train of thought. What was I just about to tell you? Well, anyways, you can look at the false flag events, Oklahoma City bombing, how Timothy McVeigh, he was a patsy. This particular shooting, this Tyler kid Robinson being made a patsy. They always do this. That's their modus of operandi. And I don't know how they get these kids to agree to do what they do in order to be the fall guy. I don't know. It's very odd. I can't remember what I was just about talking about. But anyways, all right, I'll go into this final story. And then I'll take some, if you have any questions or comments, I'll share them. My voice is running a little bit weak, so I'm going to try to pace myself. All right, here's another little known fact about the disappearance of the Malaysian airline MH370. And it has to do with a semiconductor patent that billionaire Jacob Rothschild, after the disappearance of this plane, became the sole owner of. So you ask yourself, another coincidence? No, you know better. All right, it says this. Illuminati member Rothschild is believed to have exploited the airliner to gain full patent rights of an incredible KL03 microchip. The U.S. technological company Freescale Semiconductor, who shared its rights with Rothschild, had 20 senior members on board who had just launched a new electronic warfare gadget for military radar systems the day before the plane went missing. The semiconductor company develops microprocessors, sensors, and other technology, including standalone semiconductors that perform dedicated computing functions. But the questions that arise are, why were there so many Freescale employees traveling all together? What were their jobs? Their mission? And did these employees, carry valuable cargo? With all the power our elite carry, why couldn't they track down the missing plane? Of the 239 people aboard Flight MH370, most of them were engineers and others working to make the company's chip facilities in Tianjin, China, and Kuala Lumpur more efficient. These were people with a lot of experience and technical background, and they were very important people. Hawes said, "It's definitely a loss for the company." Mitch Hawes, the vice president of global communications and investor relations. According to Freescale's website, operations for the company began in 1972 and covered an 8-hectare site that tests and manufactures microprocessors, digital signal processors, and integrated radio frequency circuits. Furthermore, it owns Freescale RF, which is involved in making solutions for aerospace and defense, including battlefield communications, avionics, HF radar, band L and S, missile guidance, electronic warfare, and identification. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Freescale shareholders include the Carlyle Group, which, if you don't know who the Carlyle Group is, that was like Cheney, Bush, all his neocon, PNAC, the Patriots for a New American Century, that neocon group, they started a defense contractor that specialized in investing in defense and the military industrial complex. And the Carlyle Group during this time became very, very wealthy, whose past advisors included ex-U.S. President George Bush Sr., former British Prime Minister John Major. Some of the company's previous clients include the construction firm owned by the family of Osama bin Laden, the Saudi bin Laden Group. You know that the Bushes and the bin Ladens were like really close friends. In fact, Osama bin Laden had given George H.W., his first $1 million to start a oil company. Now, isn't it interesting that Michael Moore, on his documentary for Fahrenheit 9/11, talked about the fact that while all of the flights in America and around the world were all grounded because of what went down on 9/11, the bin Ladens and their family members were allowed to board a large plane and flee the country. Yes, that's right. The entire family of all the Osama bin Laden people were allowed to simply leave when he was supposedly the person of interest in this terrorist attack. How does that make any sense at all? What makes this claim stand out above all the other theories is the fact that so many highly qualified staff members were on board, and if the airliner crashed into the Indian Ocean, as recently reported, then this would validate the claim all the more. Considering the large passenger jet had flown undetected for 6 hours, the elites had to be involved because they are the only ones who can accomplish such a task. Avoiding radar via cloaking technology has long been one of the objectives of the defense industry, and Freescale has been active developing chips for these military radar systems. On its website, the company says its radio frequency products meet the requirements for applications in avionics, radar communications, missile guidance, electronic warfare, and identification of friend or foe. Last June, it announced it was creating a team of specialists dedicated to producing radio frequency power products for the defense industry. And so here we have another Rothschild, Jacob Rothschild connection. Isn't it strange how all these weird happenings and occurrences, there's always a Rothschild involved, or some of the power industrial elites and banking representatives. Oh, that's interesting. Here I Am says that the Bin Ladens, their dynasty owns 1/3 of the New York Stock Exchange. Very interesting. I think the NASDAQ was sold to the Chinese, if I'm correct. That's pretty funny, Annie. She says, "We are not from here. That's why we never fit in or agreed with any of this. It's like being in a crappy hotel." Very funny. Tammy says, and it's sad how brainwashed people are over money. It's all fake as it is, but people believe that it is what they need to survive. It's really pathetic. Yes, Annie says it's as if we're in a horror movie. And unfortunately, yeah, I mean, this is like, we're the strong delusion, the great falling away. We're like civil war here in America. The liberal, the fanatical left, they without a doubt hire agent provocateurs to foment the insanity, to spark the riots. Antifa, they are all funded by big money. And they are organizing the youth to support this system of rioting. I mean, if you really look at it, follow the money, you'll see that, it's the controlled opposition of the stage left-right paradigm, which is a false controlled opposition campaign to divide and conquer, to create minorities and to pin them on each other. Dinky Dinky says we are in a matrix. Without a doubt, we are in a matrix. I think what I'll do is we'll end this with a poem. Yeah, I'll end this with a poem. One of my most favorite, and it is also from my upcoming release of The Seekers of Lost Paradise. It is called The Grand Deception as Matrix. I wrote it on the 12th of December, 2014. The Grand Deception as Matrix is all-encompassing, consuming, and broad-reaching, yet so covert in imposition, it is largely unnoticed by those born into its nurturance. So subtle is its programmed assimilation, one was never even granted choice to deviate from its forced indoctrination. Most people are raised unknowingly as slaves to its order, incarcerated by the deviant proposition of its finite machination. Generations of elder grandparents and parents ensure that the younger foster compliance to their inherited beliefs without ever second guessing their foundational instillment. Children assume swift accord with the lifelong sentences, posturing them for compliant role as good little worker bee, or the soldier ant willing to surrender life for the benefit of queen and hive. So few of even the far walkers are able to decode the dialectic fashioned as mind-controlled prison. Even those holding advantage, privileged with detailed instruction on how to see, hear, and understand, are lost to resolution when it comes to connecting all the dots underlying truth in hidden mystery. Few are granted prerogative, insight into how revelation unlocks all speculation, illuminating the real secrets of who, why we are here, what we are here to do, and where we are going in the mad debacle of this constrained season. Yep, that's it. I shortened it. I divided it, made it into 2 different poems. All right, let me check chat for final comments, anything that y'all might want to say or share. Please do like and subscribe. And we're also going to be posting other content from this channel to the Zen Garcia site as well. We haven't abandoned, haven't given up on that channel either, even though we are demonetized and many of our videos just deleted. Dinky asks if I still keep in contact with Jonathan Kleck. You know, Jonathan Kleck and I were really good friends, and we aligned in a lot of ways on a lot of teachings. Until I came out and started teaching and wrote the books about the Holy Spirit being the feminine aspect of the Godhead. For whatever reason, that information got me in trouble with a lot of people, and a lot of people abandoned affiliation with me. And Jonathan happened to be one of them. In the same way that, you know, the Carricos and John Pounders and Now You See TV, they also cut ties with me over this teaching. But, you know, it is what it is. Here I am says, have you noticed that time has sped up? It says, unless the days be shortened, there should be no flesh left. No, Dinky, I haven't spoke to Jonathan in a very long time. We used to talk all the time, but... And you know, we used to do shows together all the time as well. I don't even know if he's still doing shows or not, but... Yeah, it's unfortunate that, you know, just even if you have differences of opinions, you don't have to hate other people. Uh, you don't have to, like, you know, convict them or, um, we can be adults about stuff. We can have disagreements. It's all good. Well, God bless all of you, and thank you again for all the support of our ministry. We appreciate all of you. Have a blessed evening, and until next week, good night, all. Shalom.